Eastery is a fantastic YouTuber. I love this YouTube channel. Every single video I watch, I'm like, wow, this makes me see history and the world and the wars, particularly World War II, in a completely different light. I love his channel. He needs more subs. He needs more views. Subscribe to this guy, guys. Subscribe.
Early 2022. Russian forces are building up on Ukraine's border. Both in Ukraine and Russia, people think that this is a ruse, because invading Ukraine would not be a rational move. Still, on February 24th, the invasion is launched. So, why did Russia invade? In this video, I will give you my theory. The video goes up in the beginning of April, as the war in Ukraine has seemingly reached a stalemate. There are many videos on the internet about this conflict, which look at the same events from different angles. My theory is that the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine was caused by two factors. I call them use force to make friends and why Putin forever. Use force begins at the end of the Cold War. At that time, Europe was divided between two factions, the Soviet bloc and the West European Alliance. But the Soviet bloc collapsed, and more than 20 nations in Eastern Europe were free to choose their alliances. They could choose between Russia and the Western nations. The alignments would be determined by three things: trade, development aid, and social models. First was trade. The East Europeans produced things, and they wanted to sell them to the largest amount of people with the largest amount of money.
Segway, that's
Here,
it.
the market size was everything, and the Western nations had much larger economies than Russia.
Segway robbery, big problem in Russia.
The East European nations had to undertake radical economic reforms, and they needed much aid to catch up with other countries. The Western economies were larger and could provide much more aid to the East Europeans. The third factor was the social model. The East European...
Hang on a second. When the Soviet Union exists, weren't they supplying a lot of aid to these countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc? Wasn't that a thing? Or am I just falling into a myth here? Wasn't one of the reasons why, or some of them, didn't want to leave the sphere of influence as the Soviet Union because they were getting a lot of investment from the Soviet Union? They were almost propping them up.
Societies had recently abandoned communism and needed to choose a new model according to which to build their societies. Here too, the Russian model of powerful oligarchs and the increasing authoritarianism was not as attractive as that of the societies of Western Europe. This made the East European states favor the Western nations, which resulted in half of them joining the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. At the same time, Russia had only resources to attract Belarus into joining its institutions. But now, let's make a small detour and speculate on how the governments work. In the early 21st century, the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, steps that are now considered to be mistakes. The wrong decision might have been made because the militaries are biased towards the use of force. And the problem was that the US military had too strong an influence in the government.
Do you think we've changed our thought process now regarding these kind of invasions? Do you think this was like the final chance for an opportunity to seize power and try and instigate a new regime and try and change these countries internally? And because they didn't work, surely there's never really going to be any other possibility. Because if you compare the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq compared to the Arab Spring, oh my goodness, the Arab Spring was so less violent. There was some violence, don't get me wrong, but there was significantly more change made over such a smaller period, and it cost significantly less as well. So at the end of the day, it feels like diplomatic annex is better than peace conference, right?
This made the United States lean towards launching the invasions, which might not have been the best political move. Well, in Russia, the military and the security services are effectively responsible for running the country. And this made Russia rely more on military and security.
Hang on, is the FSB the new KGB? It is, right? The Federal Security Service of Russian Federation, the main successor agency to the Soviet KGB. Okay.
Security services to solve its problems. Russia directed these institutions to secure its sphere of influence. The first operation was rather successful.
Do you think the way we fight wars is significantly different now because we have weapons that fire so accurately over such long ranges and hit so precisely and do so much damage? Do you think even the concept of an invading force isn't even a thing anymore? Unless it was a nation that was invaded that no one was willing to assist. But I mean, to begin with, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, no one was willing to help the Afghanistanis there at that point until the Americans said start sending Stinger missiles and stuff, right? So it feels like at this point, being an invader and trying to take out another country, it just feels like next to impossible. The logistics, the attrition, the long-range weaponry. I just don't even think you can even invade nations anymore. World War III is not going to happen. I'm sorry, guys. That fantasy that you romanticize every time when you go to bed and you close your eyes is never going to happen.
After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the new republics of Armenia and Azerbaijan began a conflict over contested territories. Although initially Armenia got the upper hand, Azerbaijan made an alliance with Turkey, which left the much smaller Armenia in a dangerous position. Russia saw this as an opportunity to use its military to expand its influence. Armenia was in need of protection, and Russia sent its forces to defend the country in return for Armenia joining the Russian sphere of influence. In the 2000s, the nation north of Armenia, Georgia, began pursuing closer ties with the Western nations, and Russia decided to use the military to bring that country into its sphere. The plan was to use the tension between the Georgian government and its two breakaway regions to inflict a military defeat on Georgia and cause a pro-Russian government to take power in the country.
Can you imagine when the Czechs lost the Sudeten? The Sudeten was advantageous terrain for defending, as well as it had fortifications, well, obviously the mountains and hills. In a kind of weird way, this is kind of the same thing, isn't it? You know, like the mountain ranges to the north. If these two breakaway states are independent and not part of Georgia, Georgia is significantly exposed in the center, isn't it?
The operation was mostly successful. Russia was able to take full control over Georgia's separatist regions and halt Georgia's integration with the Western nations. But the invasion made many Georgians view Russia with hostility, and Georgia not only did not join the Russian sphere of influence, but also left the Russian-led institutions, which it already was a member of. Soon, another opportunity presented itself. The unrest of 2014 in Ukraine ended up with a Western-leaning government coming to power. This caused unrest in Ukraine's Russian-speaking regions. Russia deployed its military to increase its influence over Ukraine. It sent forces to help the pro-Russian separatists secure their territories against the Ukrainian army. Then Russia forced a deal upon Ukraine that these territories would rejoin Ukraine if Ukraine would be put in a position where it could not integrate with the Western nations. But the use of military force had reduced the support for Russia in Ukraine, and it refused to follow through with the deal and doubled down on its integration with the Western nations. With the previous attempt ending in failure, in 2022, Russia deployed its forces to fix this mistake. Here was the plan.
Fix it.
Most of the
Special
Ukrainian army
military
was
fix.
deployed near the Russian border, but Russia had established full control over Belarus. If Russia launched a surprise attack on Ukraine's capital and toppled its government, the Ukrainian military would be paralyzed and the Russian forces could cross the border and take over the country. But once again, the plan did not work. The previous use of military against Ukraine had made many people in the country hostile towards Russia, which was not part of the plan. The attempt to topple Ukraine's government failed, and the Russian move to occupy the country quickly ended in a stalemate, making the first stage of the invasion a failure. In conclusion, the specific composition of the Russian government makes it biased towards using military force for solving its problems. Therefore, it tends to give its military missions that it is not good at. This partially explains why Russia sent its military to invade Ukraine in 2022 and why the Russian military is now struggling to achieve its goals. Although some of the military operations did not do much good for Russia as a country, they did benefit the Russian government, which brings us to the second reason. In 1999, Vladimir Putin managed to maneuver himself to the position of the President of the Russian Federation.
Young boy Putin.
Post he took to keep, and he knew just how to do that. Russia had a lot of oil. During President Putin's first term, he managed to double the amount he exported, and during the following decade, the price of oil grew more than 8 times.
Do you think there was a presumption that because the EU, mostly Germany and the EU, are so intertwined economically with Russia that they expected the EU to do nothing. I mean, even if the EU was to do nothing, I'd imagine the United States, the head of NATO, and the UK, who aligns really heavily with USA, wouldn't just sit by, and allow Putin to invade Ukraine and not do anything, right?
Gave President Putin a lot of money to spend on expanding Russia's economy. During his first term, the Russian economy grew on average in double digits a year. This gave President Putin a great approval rating, and he was re-elected with more than 70% of the vote. During Putin's next term, there was more oil money at hand, which resulted in a higher economic growth and a strong approval. Due to the term limits set by Russia's constitution, this time Putin had to share power with one of his allies. The economic performance for the third term was not as spectacular due to the 2008 economic crisis.
Russia got hit harder by this than some of the other Western powers, which really surprised me. I guess if your economy is primarily based on selling petrol and gas, and if no one else is buying it, I guess you're fucked, aren't you?
Putin was good at selling oil, but almost anyone was capable of doing that. So why should Putin be supported for another term? Fewer and fewer people could answer this question. Putin could use the state's resources to keep his ratings artificially high, but genuine support for him was entering dangerous territory. Enter the Ukrainian crisis of 2014.
I remember seeing the approval ratings for Putin. I remember after the invasion of Georgia, things kind of dwindled out for a little bit, and then Ukraine happened. And I did think to myself, in between Ukraine and Georgia, I did think to myself, like, is this it? Is this the end of Putin now? Are we finally going to see an election? He's going to get knocked off, and then this.
Ukraine had a Russian-leaning president, but by that time he had lost much of his support, and he was ousted from power, which would eventually result in the election of a Western-leaning president. But not all was lost for Russia. It was not the first time a pro-Western president had come to power in the country. Last time he was replaced with a pro-Russian president, and this could happen again this time. So, Russia could just wait until the next election. But President Putin had a different agenda. He used the unrest in Russian-speaking Crimea to send his military and annex the region into Russia. This ruined the relations with Ukraine and many other nations, and resulted in sanctions imposed on Russia. The Russian economic growth slowed down, growing only 25% in the 8 years after these events, compared to the 120% before them.
Damn.
But this also resulted in President Putin's popularity soaring. By taking Crimea, he had finally given the people a new reason on why they should support him.
The problem with this strategy, this is like the classic dictator's handbook. Oh, well, I'll get my approval ratings up and I'll win future elections by declaring war and annexing territory. But there's only so much territory. Yeah, Hitler? There's only so much. Until you go too far. Too far!
Russia is threatened by the forces from the outside, who seek to weaken it, and only President Putin can oppose them. Just look how he so cunningly snatched Crimea away from the enemy.
Gasp.
This allowed for Putin to easily win a re-election to his fifth term. But as time passed, taking Crimea became less and less relevant and could not keep the approval high. So in order to secure his sixth term, President Putin needed to demonstrate that only he could deliver a major victory. Of course, this time he had to trump the taking of Crimea and decided to bring all of Ukraine into the fold. The achievement would give another boost to Putin's approval, and as Russian forces started moving towards Ukraine, the approval indeed began to rise and reached 83% by the time of making this video.
Oh my god, so he was basing his opinions and his next thing he was going to do purely on approval ratings? Well, I guess this is why autocracies don't work, I guess. This is something to think about here, guys. As much as you might live in the West and you might live in a liberal democracy and you might not necessarily agree with the ruling party or the prime minister, I don't particularly do in the UK, think of it this way. If at any point this prime minister or president or ruling party messes up and causes lots of problems, the next election time we can vote them out and they will actually successfully leave. Putin, on the other hand, is not going to leave unless he's kicking and screaming and pressing the nuke button. Things are going to be a bit different for him, right?
During his first 3 terms, he used the rising oil prices to provide Russia with economic prosperity. But this strategy became obsolete. Then he decided to convince the people that only Putin could defeat Russia's enemies. For this, he needed to show great victories abroad. Annexation of Crimea in 2014 provided him with a large boost in popularity, but it wore off, and Putin needed an even greater victory. This time he wanted to duplicate the Crimea scenario by taking over all of Ukraine. But Ukraine was not Crimea, which resulted in the first stage of the invasion failing. But here, as this video goes up, the past stops and the future starts. I started writing this script just after the war began, and here are my predictions from that time.
Oh, here we go.
I am pessimistic. Barring any extreme outcomes of the fighting, the situation in Ukraine will reach some sort of stalemate without the conflict being fully settled. The public opinion in many Western nations would decisively turn against Russia.
In the UK, universally, we're very inward thinking, okay? A lot of people's opinion about Britain is very patriotic, and we've kind of got a chip on our shoulder because of that. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think if we're unified together, we can get things done and we can work together. The problem sometimes is we kind of see ourselves as the center of the universe, and that old legacy of the British Empire is a bad smell that lingers in the background. And there's nothing wrong with being proud of that, but once again, the British Empire is gone. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it's gone. And we need to be more realistic and think more outwardly instead of internally into the UK. And one thing I've noticed recently, well, overall in the last 10 years, is that we had a very bad opinion of like Syrian refugees, Albanian refugees, Afghanistani and Iraq ones as well. Maybe because they're not Western centric, but with Ukrainians on the other hand, I've noticed social media has changed. The media is overwhelmingly positive about Ukrainian refugees, Ukrainian people. And once again, I'm not sure if it's the ethnicity, it's their religion, it's their cultural beliefs, whether they're Western thinking, or it might be just the fact that we're unified against an enemy that's easy to identify, aka Russia. Once again, I'm just speaking for someone who lives in the UK, by the way. Probably everyone in Europe probably has their own different take on this. But once again, there might be some factors there, or it might just be a soup of all those different elements that might be the reason why people in the UK and maybe other Western countries are very unified and back Ukraine in a way that I've never seen before. And I'm really old, so don't forget that. I've seen a lot of these wars.
Strong technological superiority and a massive economic advantage, which they would use to put Russia under strong pressure. But this would make many people in Russia feel threatened, which would strengthen the power of the military and the security services. Vladimir Putin may or may not be removed from power, but this will matter little, as Russia will still be ruled by its security services whose power would become unopposed. The relations between Russia and the Western nations would enter a new Cold War, which would last for a long time. I feel that if enough people had actively opposed the war, it would not have taken place. As I personally did not do anything to avert it, I feel that the war is a consequence of me not taking action. If the next major war is to be stopped, the reasons behind the wars are to be identified. In this video, I gave my thoughts on the origins of the conflict. I don't think that my theory is fully correct, and it may even have gotten something majorly wrong. Let me know in the comments. What do you think are the causes for the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Normally, he just narrates over the map and says events that have already happened in history. But this was kind of a geopolitical video where he gave his take on it, which was quite refreshing. And then his take was something I've never heard before. So, God, that was really good. Oh, my God. If you guys don't subscribe to Eastery, you really, 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 really should. Once again, this information is a bit hazy because remember, the fog of war makes everything really cloudy and social media lights up and it leaves us with a lot of misleading information. But the last understanding was the Russians pushed through Belarus and tried to get an encirclement on Ukraine by pushing from the east side and northern side from Belarus. And they got to about here, never fully encircled Kiev. And apparently the issue is they were having a lot of logistical problems to actually supplying their troops in this area. Maybe it was something to go through Belarus. Maybe it was something to do with this area of Ukraine. Maybe it was something to do with Chernobyl. When the fog of war rises in 6 to 12 months, maybe we'll find out why, but we don't know why. So they've all withdrew from this region. And now the focus is this region on eastern Ukraine. But when Putin controls all of these areas, he'll more likely declare victory. And at that point, he'll probably be willing to enter the negotiation table with the plan of saying 2 demands. One, that these regions have to be independent, just like the Georgia ones here. And also that Ukraine is not allowed to join either the EU or NATO or even work in cahoots. They have to remain neutral. I have a funny suspicion the Ukrainians might not even be up for that. I live in the West, so a lot of the information I'm getting is incredibly pro-Ukraine. So I have to think to myself, am I supporting the team that I want to win? Or am I actually thinking realistically what the outcome of this conflict will actually be. At the end of the day, when it comes down to firepower, manpower, and willingness to fight, because I've spoken to a lot of Russians that have like either DM'd me or I've spoke to on Discord or whatever, and they're very, very pro-Putin. I suppose in a way it's like the Americans when they invaded Iraq. I guess all the Americans were behind the Iraq invasion. Don't get me wrong, there was protests. I hear that. I know that was the case. But universally, the overall population backed it. And I feel like the Russians right now, they feel the same way. I think for the most part, we're going to see a favorable peace towards the Russians where those terms will be met. It'll do really well for Putin in the short term. His approval ratings will shoot up. It'll look like a victory for him. But in the long run, it will not be good for him because the West won't be happy with that. Because the West is doing everything possible right now, particularly Germany, to try and move away from the dependency on coal, gas, and oil from Russia. So overall, the economic outlook is not going to look very good for the Russians, even though the short term might look really good. Putin's approval ratings, because I think for the most part, he will achieve his goals in the east of Ukraine. The reason why the Ukrainians are so doing unbelievably well in Ukraine is one reason. No Russian soldier can fart inside of Ukraine and NATO, the US, hears about it. And that information will be instantly relayed back to the Ukrainians immediately. It's hard to say on the big scale of things, but my prediction, because this is a prediction video, is that I think right now the intelligence on this side of the West, NATO, and the United States is like way on point. They have satellites looking at all this region constantly, relaying information directly to the Ukrainians. There's no Ukrainian that can take a whiz at the side of the road without NATO finding out about it. You love this video? Well, this one you're going to love even more.